Okay, we're back with segment 3 of this discussion. And Governor, wanted to come back to just one thing that we talked about in the last hour, just to get your reaction to. Back at the time, there was a lot of focus on the labor management type issues going into the commission. We had 2 commissioners. John DePaul, we've talked about already, was the international
Vice President
for aerospace for the Machinist Union. Randy Babbitt was the president of ALPA in his pre-FAA days. A lot of discussion about and a lot of focus on those issues. At that very time as well, both John and Randy were working with Northwest Airlines, as you might remember, on trying to keep Northwest afloat, which generated even more focus on that. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic, with a lot of political pressure and interest and attention from organized labor on our work, and how that impacted what we did?
Well, Randy and John were really very good representatives for their perspectives, the groups that they represented, just as other members of the commission represented fairly and vigorously their particular backgrounds. But given the fact that thousands of people were losing their jobs in the aerospace industry, manufacturers shutting down, airlines going under, it was clearly a subject of concern, not just for the people in labor, but also on the industry side as well as government. But notwithstanding their vigorous discussion about these issues, workforce and transfers and all the other issues, we were actually responsive to that because the way we structured our hearings and knowledge gathering involved specific panels and programs and representatives from the workforce sector, from flight attendants to pilots to grounds people, the machinists. So it was a very good effort on the part of labor and industry to present their concerns, and I think it was fair, it was reasoned, and in the end, I mentioned earlier that the chemistry of our commission was quite noticeable. While we all had different points of view, we worked well together to express those points of view, to look for common ground. And so I think the fact that the Commission's report carried some concurring statements and a dissent, there was no one on that Commission who actually rejected the full set of recommendations.
In fact, I remember when we met with the President about a month after the report was finalized and submitted to the administration, John DePaul said directly to him that he supported the report.
He did.
He just wanted to see some additional action in some other areas.
Well, and in fairness to him, he was under a lot of pressure, as I guess everyone was, the President and the Congress and everyone else. They felt the need to respond to this growing concern, and I think the Commission's report is a reflection that those various viewpoints were heard, were considered in the development of the recommendations.
And just to close that one off, I'll just make an observation. You can agree or disagree or react to it, but it seemed to me that given the dire circumstance of the industry at that time, given the fact you had airlines like KLM already investing in Northwest and British Airways wanting to invest in US Airways and so forth, that the labor representatives on the Commission were more open than they might have been in maybe some other less dire times to solutions like the Commission's recommendation on foreign investment and so forth.
Yeah, and again, I think the chemistry showed that it was, I would agree with your assessment.
Let me ask you, before we get into the international issues, although it does have an international component, a question about security. Obviously this Commission was working 8 years before the September 11th attacks, although it was after the World Trade Center bombing in the basement, but nobody really saw that as an aviation issue at the time. So there was little, if any, time really focused on security matters. Have you ever thought about what the commission's work would have been like if it had occurred after 9/11?
We would have spent a lot more time on security issues, and not just from the point of view of protecting the traveling public, but from the administration of the security system itself. I think we would have spent an inordinate amount of time on such things as TSA, the screening process that goes on, the uninspected areas, such as cargo, would certainly generate a lot of comments. So yes, I've thought about it. Although terrorism was not unknown at the time
Right.
that we discussed this in 1993, but most of that was distant. I mean, notwithstanding the New York City 1993 bombing, as you said, it was not considered an aviation issue. But hijackings and things like that in many parts of the globe were
Pan Am
clearly
103.
Pan Am 103 were all those issues, but they did not focus specifically on the kinds of concerns that Congress directed us to consider.
Let's talk about the international side.
Okay.
I said early on in my opening that I think one of the Commission's real achievements was to solidify the trend toward open skies. Some people have asked me in the years since, why wasn't open skies mentioned in the report? Maybe you can talk about that a little bit, since there was only one such agreement, I think, in place before the Commission started. But talk a little bit about the Commission's work on that issue, and you referred to it in one of your answers earlier about a few minutes ago, whether you think the U.S. government was paying sufficient attention to those kinds of issues prior to that time.
I think the fact that the Commission was so strongly in favor of what we now call open skies was what really gave that topic, that theme, that need a big push. At the time, I think the only open skies agreement we had at that time in 1993 was with the Netherlands, a very small country. But I think our view was that this was just the beginning of something that could be much larger, and in fact would encourage increased liberalization and opening of international markets. It was the thought that I don't know that open skies was so much a term then, and even now it's a misleading term, because it tends to really describe a bilateral relationship more so than a multilateral one. But we really wanted to change the terms of the discussion so that we could find a new growth-oriented framework on as large a geographic base as possible that would permit the expansion of that concept, so that you did have multilateral process in place. So, you know, what that really meant was that in order to get there, we had to examine or re-examine some old taboos, such as investment restrictions, the citizenship requirement, which led us to have some very interesting discussions. But our thought was that these so-called open skies agreements could lead to expansion and growth opportunities for the industry. And frankly, that's where we saw the growth potential for the industry in response to the problems that we were charged to examine.
Yeah, I think if you read the airlines' financial reports each year, they'll bear out what you just said. They now see that as the area for opportunity.
It took a while.
It took a while. And you talked earlier too, and I think this is one of those recommendations that maybe was adopted without knowing it, but you talked earlier about, this is more of a comment I guess, but talked about the fact that the negotiators would rotate in and out. I know we had a lot of testimony about that. And you know, over the last 5 or 10 years, they had a particular person in place, John Byerly, who was part of this discussion the last time the DePaul University folks did this. And he was in place for an extended period of time and carried that weight, you know, had the confidence of everybody in industry, and really sort of did what the Commission wanted to do when it got at that ambassador recommendation. And obviously you've seen the effect with the US-EU agreement. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, but I think it's worth noting that maybe not in the exact form in which the Commission recommended it, but the thrust of the recommendation did happen.
Yeah, you know, the momentum can really be determined by the more enlightened views of industry leaders over time. Back then, we had more of a protectionist view of things. I mean, a lot of people in the industry did. And in some cases, I think we were frustrated in realizing that sometimes the momentum was going in the opposite direction. For example, U.S. carriers were concerned about ceding large portions of their very lucrative markets overseas, whereas in foreign countries, carriers were worried about the more efficient U.S. carriers invading and acquiring larger shares of their market.
Like two scorpions in a bottle or something.
So it was just was sort of a frustrating thing, but we realized that this was part of our mission, was to paint a picture, to paint a portrait of possibilities for growth that would address the economic ills confronting the industry at that time. With people being laid off, with airlines going under, you wanted to show them that you just don't address a small, discrete concern that someone may have, but to put that in a larger context and let them see that there are growth possibilities out there in the international arena was the way to go.
I think the fact that they've gone from one agreement to, I think it's 103 now, maybe shows, do you think that shows that those obstacles have been overcome?
Well, or in the process of being overcome. I mean, you know, we have the US-EU agreement, but that could easily become a US-Canada-EU agreement.
Right.
You have the Asia-Pacific region that, you know, I like to think in terms of geography or geology, tectonic plates. And, you know, the way I see this thing evolving is not one sudden emergence of a global system, but a series of tectonic plates. And the Asia-Pacific region could be one of those open skies agreements on a multilateral basis, and the US, Europe, Canada could be another one. And so in that process of evolution, you ultimately get to a global system.
One issue the Commission talked a lot about was foreign investment, the foreign investment restrictions. If you had to give weight to one or the other or choose, which do you think would be the most important thing for the U.S. government to focus on? Expanding those international air service agreements in the way you talked about, or finding a way to loosen controls on foreign investment so that that capital could flow more easily across borders and investors could actually have more of a role in the companies that they're investing in?
Well, I actually think they both have to go hand in hand. We've made a lot of progress on expanding air service, but I don't see things proceeding much further until we liberalize the citizenship requirement. And that will perhaps take a little bit more time. I'm not optimistic that that will happen in the immediate future, but I think you really have to consider them both together. And future expansion is obviously going to require some relaxation of the citizenship requirement. I just don't know when that will happen.
Yeah, as we saw with the controversy over the Dubai ports a couple of years ago, the current security situation makes that even tougher.
I think so. And when times are tight, when economies are in trouble, something like that becomes the subject of populist rhetoric and some very dangerous comments.
Yeah. Well, in the absence of the kind of policy framework the Commission talked about, the industry, as you might expect in a free market system, has taken it upon itself to approach things in a different way, forming alliances, One World and the Star Alliance and SkyTeam being the three major ones. What's your view on that outgrowth of the policy stalemate that we have right now?
Well, it's a reflection of the existence of a certain amount of creativity within the airline industry. After all, we are talking about a global business these days, but citizenship requirements restrict the ability to create a global brand airline as such. So you take the next best step. You create alliances. You provide code sharing and the ability to travel. You get global air service under perhaps the different names of carriers, but all carrying an alliance brand. So it's not ideal, but I think it's the way to get around the investment restriction. It's the best we have until investment restrictions are lifted or liberalized. But you know, it's here to stay. I've helped participate in those. I've seen them operate. I do recognize that there is some consumer confusion when you think you have service to a distant location on one airline and you get to the airport and you get on a carrier of a different brand. And if you don't explain to them that this is a part of an alliance, they're a little bit puzzled, but they get it. And that getting it may ultimately help persuade the political class that something like this really ought to go ahead and be addressed.
Well, and a big part of the alliances has been, for better or worse, I'd like your view on it, the granting of antitrust immunity, which are, a number of people think the words antitrust and immunity don't belong in the same sentence, but granting of antitrust immunity, but that's often the price that needs to be paid to get an open agreement with a particular country. Is the trade-off worth it?
Let me put it this way. It's ironic that the first thing that happens after an open skies agreement is the announcement of an immunized alliance between two carriers that previously had been competitors. But it's what we have. I don't see that really being changed. Otherwise, you wouldn't get the alliance created. So I think people recognize there's a trade-off. It's not ideal, but I don't see that being changed. Again, it's sort of like deregulation. I don't see that being unscrambled until you have investment restrictions lifted that would permit then changes in ownership and also the creation of a global brand.
You mentioned before the US-EU agreement. I know you've talked before, as you did just a few minutes ago, about maybe the US-Canada and the EU, or NAFTA-EU, or something in APEC for the Asia-Pacific. But let's go back to the US-EU agreement. What was your reaction to it? I know one of the hopes of the EU ultimately going forward is to get at the foreign investment restrictions. What do you see going forward, and what do you hope comes out of it?
Well, I think the US-EU agreement was another step forward in the opening up of international markets. To me, the agreement does allow air carriers of both parties to fly to, from, and beyond someone's territory. And I think that's really what we have in mind when we talk about international air service. I think it's changing the way perhaps the industry sees the value of these agreements. But it does something else. It does lay the groundwork for the US-Canada-EU agreement. And I think it shows people in the Asia-Pacific region that something like this is doable. So I was supportive of it when it was announced. I think it's a basis for expansion.
Yeah, I think it's sort of an interesting note. I think the way the EU and Canada dealt with the foreign investment restriction, which was to say that when it's lifted, these other things will happen. Is an interesting way forward, and may be a template for the future.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think it's a good step forward.
Yeah. Well, if you could wave a magic wand and say, here's what we need to do to get really the kind of international liberalization that we want. Well, when you wave that wand, what would you say would be the next steps for increasing liberalization? I mean, a two-part question. What do you think are the remaining big obstacles in the way that you, maybe a second wave of the wand would have to knock down?
I don't see why citizenship requirements of airlines shouldn't be treated like any other strategic industry in this country. The Exxon Florio legislation permits strategic industries in this country to have foreign ownership interest in our strategic industries, subject to certain review requirements that Exxon Florio lays out. I don't see why you can't do the same thing for the airline industry. And if you think about it, it really is, it is possible. It's easier for a foreign investor to own a piece of a U.S. missile manufacturer than to own a piece of the U.S. airline industry. And it seems to me that we really ought to look for ways to harmonize that so that if, and I happen to believe that the industry is a strategic asset of this country, but why not treat it like any other strategic asset? There is a legislative system for review of what is in our national interest and what should be protected. So treat them like other strategic industries and not push it out there and create a situation that I don't think is very healthy.
I think you're right on the Exxon Florio legislation. Kind of a little trivia point is Senator Exxon was one of the main sponsors of the commission bill.
Yes, I remember.
Set up your commission, so perhaps he would agree with you.
I would hope so.
We talked about the U.S. and EU, and there's a big standoff right now between the governments. Standoff in ICAO, so it's a bilateral standoff. It's an international standoff on the EU's emissions trading scheme and what they want going forward. The airlines are very concerned about it. Governments all over the world are unhappy about it and fighting against it. In fact, India is hosting a meeting at the end of this month of governments that are concerned about it to try to figure out a way to combat it. How do you think? And you have some experience with these kinds of issues. How do you think that'll be resolved?
At the last minute. The EU is famous for brinksmanship, and it will be resolved at the last minute. Whatever that resolution is, I don't think anyone knows at the moment, but clearly emissions should be handled on a global basis. The idea of a patchwork system of regulation of emissions is unthinkable given the international capabilities of airlines. I mean, you're flying from one country to another continent to another. How do you comply with a set of emission standards that are different in each locality? And frankly, when you look at the emission charges, there is the possibility of double charging in some cases. So I think, like noise, I think emissions should be considered on a global basis. The EU will find some face-saving way out, and it'll be resolved, but again, at the last minute.
Yeah, that's what happened with the hush kit controversy 10 years ago.
I was very much involved in that, so I'm convinced that's what will happen again.
I hope so. The EU tried that tactic with security issue liquids and gels earlier this year and ended up having to fall on their face. So hopefully you're right. Oftentimes when you talk about liberalization, it's interesting to watch the carriers get involved. A lot of governments like to back their national carrier, and in countries where you have multiple carriers like the United States, where you stand depends on where you sit. So certain carriers are all in favor of open skies in one place and totally dead set against it in another. You've already alluded to this a little bit, but I'd like you to focus in on the international liberalization and the effect on carriers or maybe they'll lose in one place in the short run, but perhaps in the long run it'll be different. What do carriers really have to fear from liberalization?
The ones that, as I alluded to earlier, the ones that have vision and the means to execute a plan have nothing to fear. And again, as I mentioned earlier, those that don't have the vision, that don't have the means to execute their plan, will be the ones that will fall by the wayside, not literally, but figuratively.
Talk a little bit, as we wrap up the discussion on the commission, talk a little bit about your mindset going into it. I know you got a lot of advice at the time from the administration and others. You talked about this a little bit before, but as you were going in, what were your hopes for it, for the commission? What kind of constraints did you feel were being placed on you? What was your mindset going in?
Well, it was interesting that after Congress created the commission and the president signed the legislation, the president, as I mentioned, was a friend, said, do the best you can. I mean, there were no prescriptions, no do's and don'ts. And by the same token, the then Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, had similar advice. So I didn't feel any constraints about what we could do or not do. I was determined, as I mentioned earlier, that this laundry list, this kitchen sink list of issues that Congress wanted us to consider within 90 days, we would do within 90 days. And that required not only reading the transcripts and the records and the committee reports that preceded the creation of the commission, but to think strategically about how we could go about addressing those various subjects. If we failed to do that, we would be criticized. If we fail to include the various segments of the aviation industry, we would be criticized. So we held this report up at the beginning of this discussion. And in the back, I was determined to include as appendices not only the legislation itself and the members of the commission, the composition of it, and the staff, but the process by which we reach these conclusions and recommendations. So, for example, the very first week, we laid out in very detail, before we ever met, we laid out this entire 90-day period. We had, the first week was a briefing, we call briefings knowledge base. And so we looked at the government's view of the airline industry. We looked at the government's view of the aerospace industry. We looked at what financial markets were saying about the industry. We looked at international negotiations, how they work. We looked at questions such as, is there a shortage of airport and airway capacity? We asked questions about deregulation. We looked at the workforce issues, the airport's view of the industry. For each one of these subjects, over the first 2 weeks of just gathering basic information, we had specific names and titles and the expertise that they possess, so that at the very beginning, people could see the roadmap that we intended to pursue. So after we had gone through that initial gathering of baseline knowledge, then we had a week devoted to dialogues with the experts in the field. Again, looking at industry and labor, looking at government and the consumers. And then we had, and again, we moved into about the third or fourth week looking at issues and options. We wanted to find out, as we began to then meet separately in workforce groups, was what are the issues in these areas? And we had a couple of areas that we wanted to examine, and we subdivided ourselves. System capacity issues. We had domestic aviation issues. We had international issues. We had finance team issues. So in looking at that, we spent time looking at the various issues and then what were some possible options. We then reconvened for a week and talked, and each subcommittee reported back their view of the issues based on the knowledge that we had gathered and what we knew about it from our own expertise. We looked at how to finance these issues. And then as we began to close in, we brought the industry and labor and other people back. We had closing discussions with aerospace manufacturers, with the airlines and the workforce. And then we began to write the report, and as we mentioned earlier, on the 88th day of the 90-day time frame, we issued the report. And as I mentioned to someone during one of the breaks, we know that government reports, commission reports often are received, placed on the shelf, never again to see the light of day. Based on some experience I had as governor with budget issues, I wanted a report that was clear, concise, compelling, but also unforgettable. And one way to make it unforgettable was to make it large enough that it could not be put on a shelf and it could not be lost. The CEO of Gerald in Tokyo one day made a humorous complaint. He said, "This is on my coffee table. I cannot put it on my shelf. I cannot lose it." And I said, then we have succeeded. This was precisely what we wanted. And interestingly enough, I've had friends of mine over the years tell me that after this report had been issued, there were members of Congress and others on their flights back home had this report out looking at it. You know, it's filled with charts and graphs. It made it easy for editorial writers who were trying to get out of town early on a Thursday or Friday, but had an obligation to print an editorial for the weekend. They could go to this report. They had graphs, charts, pictures, and it helped market the message. So my mindset was we had something specific to accomplish within a specific time frame, within a budget that we thought was capable. My mindset was, at the beginning, I didn't know where we were going, but I knew how to get there. And by getting there, we had specific schedules laid out. And out of following that schedule with themes and experts and a work process, out of that would come a consensus from the experts. And with that, then we could publish the report.
You anticipated my question about the size of the report. But in terms of the first thing you talked about, the timeline and the plan, I think it's useful for people to know, you know, that there was a commission of 14 other people, some of whom you knew, many of whom you didn't. And so there was a need to show them, you know, seriousness of purpose, and that you and those of us on the staff and the others in whom they were going to be placing their lives for the next 90 days, because there was a lot of meetings, that you could lead them to the promised land, to use a Moses analogy. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about sort of the reaction you got from the commission when you did present them that plan on the first day.
Well, on the first day in the Indian Treaty Room in the old Executive Office building, after the President had addressed us, I laid out this plan. I mean, it was a 90-day plan. And as I mentioned, the various weeks, the assignments, the themes, the people had all been developed in anticipation of that first meeting. The first question was, can we get the life of this commission extended? 90 days will not be enough. And I said, no, I don't think we need more than 90 days. We can do it. And here's how we can do it. And then I laid out the schedule that's printed in the back of the report. When they saw that, they realized that whatever area of interest they had, whatever knowledge base they brought, that was covered in this agenda for the entire 90 days. It made a difference. It melted whatever concerns they may have had at that initial meeting, and it created a bonding effect, an adhesion that was almost palpable. After that, we just made it happen.
So with all that, you know, President Bill Clinton appointed you to do this, and by all accounts, it turned out pretty well. Let's say 15, 20 years from now, we need another commission, and President Chelsea Clinton comes to you and says, you did a great job for my dad, I need you to do the same for me. What would you say, and what would your mindset be?
I think I would reread General Sherman's statement. If I recall the words correctly, it was, if nominated, I will not run, and if elected, I will not serve. I've done mine.
Or what was Morris Udall's take on that? If,
My wife would have a different interpretation. She would say, I would accept.
She'd probably be right. She usually is. Or Morris Udall's adaptation of that. If nominated, I'll flee to Mexico, and if elected, I'll fight extradition. Well, I have one final commission question, and then I wanted to leave a little bit of time, if we have a few minutes, for some broader context. But the final commission question is, how do you want the commission to be remembered? And then the final context question I really have is, you know, we have, as you said, we have a lot of the same problems today. We have a big challenge in our country getting some of these things done. A lot of the same things are still needed to be done. And I'd like to just get your thoughts on where we find ourselves as a country right now, which really does get back to why more of what the commission recommended didn't get done.
At the beginning, I mentioned that the three areas of this report, three principles that can be drawn from this report, are efficiency and technological superiority. That was true then, it is still true today. Financial strength and access to global markets was true then, it's true today. So in many respects, I think this report, the three principles of the report, are as applicable today as then. We put a nail in the coffin of re-regulation. We pointed to the need for increased financial strength of the industry, and we clearly made this point that the growth area for aviation is in the international field, and that we need to find ways to expand from our protectionist mindset to one that opens up global markets to the benefit of the traveling public as well as the industry itself. So I think this report, if it's going to be remembered, besides its colorful size, should be remembered as laying a roadmap down for others to follow. The principles, I think, are just as viable today as they were then.
I know that you've thought a lot about, over these 18 years, the need to do some of these things and the need to do a number of other things in this country to invest in the future. That's really what the report is all about, investing in the future, and where we started this conversation back at the beginning. And I'd like to just get to wrap up this conversation, I'd like to get your take on where things are now as a country and going forward. We'll stipulate that what's been done since the commission has been done, what hasn't been done. Can't change that, but how do we move forward?
I'm an optimist by nature. I believe in the power of ideas, and as I mentioned earlier, if you want to market a message, you have to have a message, and that message has to be clear, concise, and compelling. And in order to make that happen, there has to be a context. Without a context, you can't prepare your message, and if you're not prepared, you can't persuade people to buy that message. While I'm an optimist by nature, I'm also a realist, and I recognize that some of the things that we want, some of the things that are needed, may not be achieved in the immediate future. And I say that for this reason. 20 years ago, when we were looking at this subject, 15, 20 years ago, if you could summarize what was happening in one word, that one word, to my way of thinking, was globalization. I mean, it drove everything I did as governor. Today, if you had to find one word to describe the situation, it would be debt. And debt has become very much a part of our political conversation. If you look at the federal taxes, for example, they constitute 15% of our GDP. Federal spending is 24% of GDP. So, you know, just looking at it in broad terms, that's an unsustainable pattern. And the country is beginning to grapple with that. That's what I think elections for the next couple of years will be all about. 10 years ago, the CBO predicted surpluses as far out as the eye could see. They even predicted that the national debt would be retired within a decade. And today, 10 years later, we have deficits as far as the eye can see and no sight of when the debt will be paid off. We've lost revenue from 2 recessions, 2 wars, plus Libya, all financed there on borrowed money. But it is easy for people to point the finger at government and say that it's overspending, and therefore we should not do any more spending, whether it's investing or consumption. I would say we ought to look in the mirror, because when this past recession started in 2007, remember this number 138, because that was the ratio of household debt to household disposable income. That was the ratio, 138. It's now down 4 years later to about 110%. That is also unsustainable. So people have been deleveraging. They've been paying down their debt instead of buying. So if you want to understand why the economy is not booming along at its prior rate of 70, 80% based on consumption, people are nervous, they're worried, they're paying down their debt. And they've really got a long way to go before they get back to that historic high, previous high of, say, 80, 70, 80%. So I think it's going to be a while before we get out of this system of concern about debt and deficits. I'm not sure that means the system is broken, but the volatility of the markets and the preoccupation of 24-hour, 7-day coverage of media events, I think means that this is going to be churning for a while. And it contributes, I think, to turning ordinary disagreements in public life into mushrooming, governing clouds, with unpredictable results. Little things that used to be done by holding the nose in Congress now becomes a stalemate, a shutdown of government. And when you think about it, if you stake out your bargaining position at the very beginning, there's no basis then for mutual concession. So how do you find compromise? How do you find consensus on a troubling issue when something like that is going on? So that leads to polarization. Polarization leads to paralysis. And so government, in the minds of the public, basically is at a standstill. That affects the ability of government to make these investments in our infrastructure, particularly the air traffic control thing that we talked about this morning. And in the process, I would also say that because of the condition in which we find ourselves, this one-word description of our time is debt as opposed to globalization. What it means is we've lost our ability to make distinctions that we used to take for granted. For example, we've lost the ability to distinguish between campaigning and governing. I've always thought that when an election is over, it's time to govern. The campaigning never stops anymore. And so that affects the ability to get anything done in Washington. We've lost the ability to distinguish between consumption and investments. As we said this morning, looking at some of these areas that require funding, if you look at long-term investments on a capital budget basis, as state and local governments and businesses do, but the federal government treats it as just spending, then we lose something in the process. We don't distinguish anymore between reaction and planning. Issues are not viewed in context. So if issues are treated as if they were in a vacuum, unrelated to other things, then it contributes to the paralysis and the polarization that I think is going to make governing very difficult for a few years. I don't know, I've been looking for optimistic trends. So far I haven't seen very many of them. But that doesn't obviate the need for us to continue to market the message that air service is an essential part of our transportation system, and the purpose of transportation is to move people and products from one place to another. It's an essential part of our economic growth patterns for the future, and if we fail to market that message, we will never ever really catch up to the promise that I think air service offers to this country and to our economy.
All of which is probably why President Chelsea Clinton will have to ask you to chair another commission.
No.
Well, Governor, I see Professor Havel has joined us, which I think means the end of our discussion. Enjoyed it very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you, Governor Baliles, and thank you, Greg Principato, for your energetic, sustained, and stimulating contribution to our Conversations with Aviation Leaders series. The perspectives that you've been offering, Governor, in the last 3 hours from your ringside seat in the unfolding events of airline deregulation, from what you call the age of globalization to sadly, the age of debt, I think will be of great interest to anyone who wishes to reflect on the legal and economic development of the air transport industry in the United States and in the wider world. It was interesting to learn how much pressure could have been brought on the Commission to propose re-regulation. And I found that a fascinating part of your discussion. The horror of a revived Civil Aeronautics Board must have been on your mind during that period. It's interesting to learn how you brought air traffic control into the public debate, and it has never left the public debate. And I think before your commission that was not the case. It was interesting to learn how you ramped up the issue of international air transport liberalization. You didn't use the term open skies in the report, but you clearly set the stage for the development of an open skies policy. And as a governor, it was interesting to learn from you the role of the states, as well as the federal government, in advancing air transportation policy, and your perspective, your related perspective, that the role of aviation is to be a key catalyst in economic growth, and the planning, the agenda shaping of state governments as well as the federal government must reflect that understanding. And finally, I think I saw a recurrent theme in your discussion of the importance of political will, and how political will is ultimately what changes the approach to these issues in air transport, and your closing theme of marketing the message, market the message, which of course explains, as I asked you to do at the very beginning of our discussion 3 hours ago, why such a large report physically, and as you said, it keeps congressmen busy on airplanes. It sends the message. So indeed, I think this has been a wonderful experience for us to hear your comments. And by the way, Governor Baliles recently wrote a commentary for the 10th anniversary Spring 2011 edition of Issues in Aviation Law and Policy, entitled Time Flies, Observations about the Decade Past and a Look Toward the Future. And I commend it to your attention if you want to follow up on some of the thoughts that the Governor has shared with us today. And speaking of issues in aviation law and policy, Managing Editor Steve Rudolph is currently preparing the transcripts of some of the earlier conversations for publication in a special edition of IALP, which is scheduled to appear next spring. And our plan is to have all the conversations, including the Governor's, published through these special editions. Governor Baliles, again, thank you for going on the record with us today. I hope that many people will access and enjoy today's conversation on the website. Thank you, Greg Principato, for being our interlocutor. And I wish both of you continued health and success in the years ahead. We will have a 6th iteration of our series in spring 2012, details to be announced. For the moment, goodbye from the International Aviation Law Institute in Chicago, and thank you for watching.
And let me add my thanks to DePaul University, the College of Law, and the Institute, and the Oral History Project, and Brian Havel, and John Mulligan, and Steve Rudolph for their generous hospitality for their cooperation in making this possible.
Thank you
Thanks.
very much, Governor. We appreciate that.